We usually think of elections as the opposite of violence, right? It's how we settle our differences peacefully. But what happens when an election itself is the thing that lights the fuse? Today, we're diving into the 1860 presidential election, the democratic event that literally broke America and marched the country straight into the Civil War.
And get this wasn't some angry tweet after the results came in. This was published in a major South Carolina newspaper before a single vote was even counted. They were openly, publicly calling for revolution. For the South, the stakes weren't just political, they were existential, and they were making it crystal clear they had no intention of accepting the results if they lost.
And that's the big question here, isn't it? The central paradox we're going to unpack. The whole American experiment is built on the peaceful transfer of power. So how on earth did one perfectly legal, constitutional election become the final shove that sent the nation into a 4-year bloodbath? Let's figure it out.
To really understand the explosion, you have to look at the powder keg it was sitting on. See, the 1860 election didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the absolute climax of decades of political failure, where every single compromise had fallen apart, all thanks to one single inescapable issue: slavery.
I mean, the 1850s were basically a dress rehearsal for war. You had John Brown's raid on a federal armory, which sent waves of terror through the South. You had pro- and anti-slavery settlers literally killing each other in the streets out in bleeding Kansas. And then, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision basically torched any hope of a legal compromise, declaring that slavery couldn't be banned anywhere. The argument wasn't about words anymore. It was about violence.
So by the time 1860 rolls around, the basic tools for compromise are just gone. They're completely broken. The one last institution that was holding the North and South together, the Democratic Party, was about to shatter over slavery, and that single crack in the political system is what set the stage for the whole disaster.
So, with the Democratic Party split wide open, the nation suddenly finds itself in this bizarre situation. We don't have 2 main candidates for president, we have 4. And these 4 guys weren't just 4 different politicians. They represented 4 totally different, completely incompatible ideas for what America should be.
This election really was like a perfect map of the nation's fractures. First up, you've got Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, only in the North, saying slavery will not expand, period. Then, all the way on the other side, you've got John Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats, demanding the federal government protect slavery everywhere. And stuck in the middle, you had Stephen Douglas basically saying let the states figure it out, and John Bell just begging everyone to please just save the Union. There was zero overlap, no room left to negotiate.
So, with these 4 mutually exclusive options on the ballot, the country goes to the polls. And the results, well, they didn't heal anything. They just threw a giant spotlight on just how fundamentally and geographically divided America had become.
Okay, here's the number that sent an absolute shockwave through the South. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote. Let that sink in. A clear majority of Americans, more than 60%, voted against him. So, how in the world did he win?
Well, the answer, as you might have guessed, is the Electoral College. Even though his popular vote total was low, he absolutely crushed it in the electoral count. Because his 3 opponents split the vote, Lincoln was able to sweep the populous free states in the North. When all was said and done, he didn't need a single Southern vote to win the presidency.
And that right there, that was the new, terrifying reality. For the very first time, the North had proven it could elect a president and control the entire federal government all by itself. For the South, this wasn't just a political defeat. It was a demographic death sentence. It was proof that their power inside the Union was gone for good. So you end up with this wild situation. One election interpreted in 2 completely opposite ways. For the North, it's like, hey, democracy worked. Our guy won, fair and square, according to the Constitution. But for the South, it felt like a hostile takeover. It was proof that they were now a permanent minority, and their entire way of life was at the mercy of a North they saw as an enemy.
For the leaders in the Deep South, this outcome wasn't something to be debated in Congress. No, this was an existential crisis that demanded immediate and drastic action. That ball of revolution we talked about earlier, they were ready to give it a shove.
So what was their justification for just leaving the country? Well, it really boiled down to 3 core arguments. First, they believed that if they couldn't expand slavery, it would slowly suffocate and destroy their entire cotton-based economy. Second, they were terrified that any move towards abolition would unleash social chaos and race war.
And finally, they argued that the Union was just a voluntary pact between states, and they had a constitutional right to leave to protect their property. And by property, they meant 4 million enslaved human beings.
And boy, did they move fast. The reaction was immediate, shockingly fast. Just 44 days after Lincoln's election, boom, South Carolina's out. Then, like dominoes tipping over, 6 more states followed within 6 weeks. This wasn't a slow, careful process. It was a coordinated, almost panicked rush for the exits.
But hold on. There was still one last, tiny window of opportunity to pull back from the brink. The 4-month gap between Lincoln getting elected in November and him actually taking office in March. This was the final chance for some kind of political solution. But instead, it was just filled with a vacuum of leadership and one last failed attempt at compromise.
You see, the sitting president, James Buchanan, was a lame duck, and he was completely paralyzed. He told Congress that secession was illegal, but then, in the same breath, said he had no power to actually do anything to stop it. I mean, can you imagine? It was the worst of both worlds. It created this 4-month free-for-all where the seceding states could write their own constitution, seize federal forts, and basically prepare for war with absolutely no opposition from the White House.
So, while the president did nothing, Congress made one last desperate Hail Mary pass. It was called the Crittenden Compromise, and it would have amended the Constitution itself to permanently protect slavery south of the old Missouri Compromise line, forever. It was a massive concession to the South, and pretty much the very last off-ramp to avoid all-out war.
But the president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, refused to take that off-ramp. As this quote shows, he was absolutely unwilling to bend. He had won the election fair and square on the principle of stopping the expansion of slavery. From his point of view, to give that up now would be to surrender to a threat and make the whole election meaningless. So he told his party to kill the compromise in Congress. And they did.
And that's it. That's the causal chain to war. You can see how each step leads directly to the next. The political system shatters, which allows for a purely sectional victory. That victory proves to the South that their power is gone forever. They see that as an existential threat, which triggers secession. And when that final, last-ditch compromise is rejected on principle, the path to war is set in stone.
So in the end, that's the story. The peaceful, constitutional process of an election provided the legal trigger. It gave one side the legitimate power of the government, and the other side saw that as so completely intolerable that their only remaining options were to either submit or to revolt. They chose revolution. They began seizing federal property, and a political crisis became a military one.
Lincoln himself said after he won, "The tug has to come." He knew this confrontation was unavoidable. And it leaves us with a pretty sobering question to think about today, doesn't it? In an era of intense political division, what are the guardrails that prevent a single election from once again becoming a nation's breaking point?